Throughout the Second World War, there were many people who sold their souls to their country as enemies. Some would side with the Germans because they were virulent Nazis, and they went on to work for the regime. For example, Lord Haw Haw William Joyce was a notorious broadcaster who aimed to demoralise the British people, but his work actually had other impacts which were more comedic. Some betrayed their neighbours, and they became hunters for the Gestapo and other Nazi authorities, and because of their actions, many people went to concentration camps because of this. At the end of the war, different countries tried to bring their traitors to justice, and this even included prime ministers and high-ranking members of their former governments. In this documentary, we look at 5 different traitors who were all executed at the end of the Second World War. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. William Joyce was born in New York on April 26, 1906, to British parents. His father was a US citizen of Irish origin, and his mother was from a well-off Anglo-Irish family. He only lived in America a few years before his family moved to Ireland when William was 3 and he grew up here. Whilst only being around 15, he was recruited into the British Army during the Irish War of Independence and worked as a courier. Allegedly, during his walk home from school, at one point he was almost assassinated by the IRA. However, because of the dangers he faced, he was sent out of the country to Worcestershire in England. Whilst here he continued learning, and during his studies at university he became obsessed with fascism. During a meeting in support of a Conservative Party candidate for Lambeth North in the general election, Joyce was set on by a group of communists and attacked. During this brawl he was slashed in the face by a razor, which left a huge permanent scar on his face that ran from his earlobe to the corner of his mouth. William Joyce after this then rose throughout the different ranks of different fascist organisations in Britain and joined the British Union of Fascists in 1932, led by Oswald Mosley. Joyce spoke out and was noted for his commanding presence and speaking skills. For example, it was said, "Thin, pale, intense. He had not been speaking many minutes before we were electrified by this man, so terrifying in his dynamic force, so vitriolic." He was later sacked in 1937 by the BUF and Mosley and became embittered with the group, forming a different breakaway organisation called the National Socialist League, the NSL. The NSL wished to bring Nazism to Britain to create a new version of British fascism. However, as the Second World War broke out, the leaders of the group opposed Joyce's efforts and chose to support Hitler's ideas rather than Joyce's. Because of this, Joyce became an alcoholic, drinking his problems away. However, after the NSL was dissolved, he moved to Germany. For over a year he had been planning to leave Britain for Nazi Germany, and he arrived in Germany shortly before the Second World War was declared and before they had invaded Poland. Once he arrived in Berlin, it wasn't long before he began to work with the Nazis. He was recruited by Joseph Goebbels' Reich Ministry of Propaganda and was given his own radio show on German radio's English service. He was given his own show called Germany Calling, and Joyce wished to encourage fascists in Allied countries to help spread Nazi propaganda, and he became the British mouthpiece of propaganda for the Nazis. Joyce immediately began to work, and he tried to convince the Britons that the working class were being oppressed by an alliance between the middle class and Jewish businessmen inside the upper class, who manipulated and controlled the government. Germany Calling was aimed to reach out to the UK and also the US, and British audiences in particular found the show to be rather quality entertainment. Many believed it to be rather comedic. However, there was a desire to hear what the enemy was saying during the war, as information was heavily censored, but the British government did try to discourage the public from listening to Joyce's programme. The broadcasts often urged the British public to surrender, and for this many found it amusing. Joyce's programme was listened to by millions, and as time went on his programme became more violent and virulent. When the Nazis invaded France, he emphasised the might of the German army, threatening Britain with invasion, and sometimes the British public did feel threatened. However, overall his propaganda had a minimal effect on British morale. Eventually the audience grew tired of Joyce, and he developed the nickname Lord Haw Haw, a name which was actually given to a previous presenter of Germany Calling. The nickname came about due to Joyce's rather upper-class English accent. Even Allied soldiers listened to Haw Haw's broadcasts, hoping to learn information about the fate of Allied soldiers and air crews. As the Second World War turned against the Germans, his broadcasts changed in their tone. As the Allies began huge bombing campaigns against towns and cities, Joyce became more negative and downtrodden in his speeches, and he made his final broadcast during the Battle of Berlin on the 30th of April 1945. During this he was drunk and rambled on about how the Soviet Red Army could not be trusted. He finished with a final Heil Hitler and wished everyone farewell. The next day the Hamburg radio station which Joyce was using was captured, and he then travelled with his wife to Flensburg, near to the German border with Denmark. It was here, of course, Admiral Dönitz set up his short-lived Nazi government after Hitler's death. There was a plan to take the Joyces to Sweden, but they decided to remain in Flensburg. They did move to a small village living with a British widow for 2 weeks. However, the British government and the Allies had been searching heavily for Joyce. MI5 were looking for him, along with a special army unit known as T-Force, who were linked with arresting many war criminals and were extremely specialist soldiers. On the 28th of May 1945, the Joyces decided to go to the village of Kufermoiler to go and buy food, and they then walked through some woods before having an argument. William Joyce then decided to go for a walk alone in the woods that afternoon, and then decided to rest up having a sleep. He then took the road back home to see his wife, however was spotted by British intelligence officers. They approached him and Joyce spoke in French, however one of the soldiers recognised his voice. Joyce then went to get something out of his pocket, possibly his forged identity papers, and Lieutenant Geoffrey Perry fired his pistol at Joyce and he was placed under arrest. A further search turned up Joyce's true papers, and he was taken to a British military hospital for treatment for the gunshot wounds. It was a German Jew, Geoffrey Perry, who was fighting for the British Army, who had inflicted the wound to rub salt in it for Lord Haw Haw. Joyce was then transferred to London to be tried on 3 different counts of high treason, however there were issues. Joyce held a British passport, although lied about his country of origin to get it, however he had never been a true British subject. Because of this it was argued that he could therefore not be tried for treason, however this evidence of possession was enough for the prosecution to begin, and despite being acquitted of 2 charges, he was convicted of being a person owing allegiance to our Lord the King, and whilst a war was being carried on by the German realm against our King, did traitorously adhere to the King's enemies in Germany by broadcasting propaganda. Joyce appealed but the conviction was upheld and he was sentenced to death. He allegedly wrote afterwards, "In death as in life I defy the Jews who caused this lost war, and I defy the power of darkness which they represent. I warn the British people against the crushing imperialism of the Soviet Union. May Britain be great once again, and in the hour of the greatest danger in the West, may the standard be raised from the dust, crowned with the words, 'You have conquered none the less.'" Other accounts state how he may have said the swastika should also be raised from the ground. On the cold morning of the 3rd of January 1946, a large crowd had gathered outside the Victorian Wandsworth prison in London, the largest of London's prisons at the time. Some people came to protest against Joyce's execution, however some wanted to be as close to the last execution for treason to occur in Britain. Joyce woke early and ate no breakfast but drank a cup of tea. At 1 minute to 9 a.m, an hour later than was planned, the governor of Wandsworth Prison came to Joyce's cell to inform him that his execution time had come. Joyce did not have long to walk, with the execution chamber being a few yards away, however Joyce's knees were trembling. Albert Pierpoint was his executioner, and he stated that his last words were, "I think we'd better have this on, you know." As Joyce was led to the gallows inside the prison, Pierpoint looked him in the eyes, placed a black hood over his head, and then placed a noose around Lord Haw Haw's neck. He was placed over the trapdoor, and then a few seconds later Pierpoint pulled the lever that released the trapdoor. Instantly Joyce's spinal cord snapped and he was dead. It was said that Joyce's scar had burst open and blood was dripping onto the floor. At 8 minutes past 9 a.m, a police officer came out of the prison and pinned the official announcement of Joyce's hanging, and a group of men in coats raised their right arms in salute and performed a Heil Hitler gesture. William Joyce's remains were buried in an unmarked grave within the prison. William Joyce's execution at the time was slightly controversial, as was his trial. However, it was clear that he defected from Britain to the Nazis shortly before the war broke out, and that he worked for the Third Reich to help them get the edge over the Allies. His propaganda efforts were aimed to disrupt the British war effort, and for this they saw it as revenge to place him on trial after the conflict. Whether Joyce's punishment was in fact too harsh remains debatable, as he was a man who hadn't taken any lives during the Second World War. His execution was one which was historic, and the story of Lord Haw Haw remains one which is still incredibly interesting. Vidkun Quisling was born on the 18th of July 1887 inside of southern Norway. His father was a Lutheran priest, and his mother was also from a very wealthy family and the richest of the local region. As a young boy, Vidkun was said to have been shy and quiet, but also helpful, and he had a positive relationship with his family. When he was at school, he was bullied, but was also rather intelligent, and he specialised in mathematics, and he also excelled in natural sciences and history. In 1905 he enrolled in the Norwegian Military Academy, and he actually scored the highest in the entrance examinations for the academy, and he continued to excel inside military colleges. In November 1911, Quisling then joined the Army General Staff, and during the First World War Norway were neutral, and he was then, following the conflict, sent as a military attaché. He spent the next couple of decades travelling around different lands, such as Finland, England, Switzerland and Germany. He spent 5 years inside the Soviet Union, and he gushed over how Trotsky had managed to mobilise the Red Army, and he became an expert on Russian affairs. He created his own political ideas and beliefs, and he referred to this as universalism. He wrote a 700-page manifesto, and he tried to explain the world through this, and his policies attempted to provide a way to bring nations together under what Quisling referred to as world unity. But his idea also had radical parts to it, and he believed in Nordic racial superiority. He was also anti-Semitic, and he believed that world unity could be achieved with the Nordic government working against Jewish people. However, Quisling then returned for the final time to Norway in 1929, and he rose throughout different governmental positions, and he served as a Norwegian Minister of Defence, and he was a member of the Agrarian Party. However, the political party did not appoint him as the leader, and because of this, Quisling then left to form his own party. Quisling formed National Unity, which was known as National Samling, and he became the leader of this. National Unity had a number of different ideas that encapsulated Quisling's ideas, and they were to begin with not very successful, only scoring 2.2% of the vote in 1933. But 3 years later, in the final elections before the Second World War broke out, the party took less of the vote, only 1.8%. This was a very poor showing for Quisling, and because of this he was then forced to consider how he would ever take power in Norway, as his party did not hold a single seat inside of the Norwegian Parliament. But in 1939, Quisling turned his ideas towards the Second World War, and he lectured inside the nation about the Jewish problem in Norway, and he overtly demonstrated his support to Adolf Hitler. He sent Hitler a 50th birthday card, and said in this that he was thankful as he claimed that Hitler had saved Europe, and he also said that Norway would have to ally itself and go with Germany. He was invited to Nazi Germany in 1939, and he went on a tour of a number of cities, and he was received well inside the nation, and his party were given significant funds by the Nazis, and they began to spread Nazi sentiment and ideas. He continued to lead his party, despite the fact they were not in power, and on the 14th of December 1939 he met Hitler. Hitler stated he would respond to any British invasion of Norway, that the Germans would launch a counter-invasion, and he said there would be peace between the Germans and the Norwegians, but Quisling had plans for a coup, and he gave over intelligence to the Nazis about specific defences and protocols inside the Norwegian armed forces. With this he was now collaborating with the Nazis and the Germans. But it was in the morning of the 9th of April 1940 that Germany invaded Norway by air and sea, and they intended to capture the king and the government, including the Prime Minister. But evacuations had taken place, and the Germans expected the government to surrender, but the invasion continued when they did not. Quisling spoke with the Germans and reached a conclusion that a coup was necessary, and he was later told he should establish a government, that this would be given the backing of Adolf Hitler. He took to the radio to announce a coup, and also he told people that they should welcome the invading Germans, and he also claimed that any resistance would be met with the most serious consequences. However, this coup lasted only 6 days, as the Nazi leadership ordered him to step down, as the Norwegian king refused to accept Quisling's government, and this meant that Germany had to continue to invade Norway, and the nation then fell on the 19th of June 1940. But the Nazi leadership appointed Josef Terboven, the Reich Commissar of the country, as they knew how unpopular Quisling was, and he even found his political party outlawed, but Quisling was then given a position as the head of the cabinet under Terboven. He was appointed the Prime Minister of the national government in 1942 and was practically overseeing a puppet state under German control. He brought a number of laws in, including one that enabled the seizure and arrest of all Norwegian Jewish men, and also introduced a policy to confiscate Jewish-owned property and assets, and Norwegian Jews were forced to be registered. Inside the nation, there were Nazi officials who worked with Quisling and his collaborators to then arrest Jewish men, women and children, and mass deportations occurred as they were sent to concentration camps. Many of those were then gassed inside of Auschwitz as soon as they arrived, and only a small percentage of Norwegian Jews survived the war after the roundups had taken place. He tried to raise volunteers for the German war effort as the Second World War turned against the Germans, and Quisling wanted to regain faith in the eyes of Hitler, and he committed Norway to the total war for the Germans. He wanted to keep the Third Reich strong, and on the 20th of January 1945, Quisling made a final trip to see Adolf Hitler. He promised Norway's support in the final part of the war, but the Nazis had intended to embark on a scorched earth policy in northern Norway, and this was against Quisling and the party's ideas. The Nazis even shot Norwegian civilians who refused to evacuate and move, and there were also heavy Allied air raids in the nation, but he spent the last few months of the war trying to prevent Norwegian deaths, but Quisling ordered police not to offer armed resistance to the Allies in May 1945. For his collaboration with the Nazis and the Germans, it was argued that Quisling should be arrested, and he handed himself into the police on the 9th of May 1945. He was held inside specifically cell 12 in the main police station in Oslo, and he had only a bucket for a toilet and a small table in his room. He was kept locked up for 10 weeks before he was moved to the Akershus fortress to be sent to trial. Quisling was tried in relation to the coup and also the orders he had issued when he was inside of power, and he was accused also of collaboration. He denied all of the charges that he was accused of and claimed he'd only done what was best for a free Norway. However, he was also accused of murder, theft and embezzlement, as well as a very serious charge of conspiring with Adolf Hitler. In the final days of his trial, Quisling's health did take a turn for the worst, and some thought he would be pardoned, but he was for his actions sentenced to death, and he was convicted of all except a few smaller charges. Appeals were sent in for Quisling's release, however these were never accepted, and he was held inside of Akershus fortress to await his execution. He was awoken at around 2 a.m. on the 24th of October 1945, and he was told that his execution was to be performed imminently. This was said to have been performed in the greatest secrecy, and he was led into a clearing around 40 minutes after he woke up inside of the fortress by a number of guards. Quisling was stood opposite a firing squad who had gathered, made up of Norwegian military policemen, and there were only a very few select witnesses to see the execution. This included a clergyman and priest who had offered spiritual guidance in his final moments, as well as an officer who was ready to give the order to fire, as well as a number of members of the State Prosecution Office. Many, including Quisling's own prosecution, were not informed about the execution, and Quisling stood opposite his firing squad, and the order to fire was then given. The bullets crashed into him, and the former leader of Norway and the Nazi collaborator was instantly killed. It was then recorded and written that his body would be dissected by a professor who would examine his brain. Vidkun Quisling, as mentioned, is considered today a terrible traitor who has gained a reputation at the end of the war as a man who was weak and power-hungry, and he took advantage of the situation of the Second World War to rise throughout the ranks of governmental power. He was a man who passed secrets and intelligence to the Germans, and he was also responsible for the deaths of many different people, and for this he was sentenced to death himself. Quisling was a man who supported the German invasion of Norway, and he also met Hitler a number of times, and he did submit to the Nazi dictator, but stood in a clearing opposite a firing squad in the walls of a fortress. Vidkun Quisling was executed. Born on the 14th of September 1901 within the Russian Empire, Andrey Vlasov initially sought for a career within religion. As he grew older, he attended a Russian Orthodox seminary and began to study religion and divinity with the prospect of becoming a priest. He studied at the time of the Russian Revolution and quit his spiritual studies to pursue agricultural sciences. In 1919 he joined the Red Army and saw action fighting in Ukraine and the Crimea, and he was noted for his competency and leadership skills. He continued with his service to the military, but in 1930 joined the Communist Party. After this he was sent to different areas to carry out important work for the government, and was even sent to China to work as an advisor for a senior official in the Chinese military. When he returned at the end of 1939, Vlasov was assigned the commander of the 99th Rifle Division, which quickly became one of the best divisions within the whole of the Red Army. Vlasov quickly asserted his authority and control, turning them into a fantastic fighting unit, and for this he was promoted to the rank of a Major General. At this time in the Second World War, it was becoming clearer that Adolf Hitler would spring Operation Barbarossa and invade the Soviet Union in full force. For a while it seemed that Hitler would continue his march east towards Russia and to try and bring down the Communist Soviet Union. As the Germans and their allies invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Andrey Vlasov was left commanding the 4th Mechanized Corps. He then also commanded the 37th Army near to Kiev, and during intense fighting with the Wehrmacht, he just escaped being encircled and captured by the enemy. He continued to engage his troops against the invading Nazi army, and as Hitler turned his attention towards Moscow, it was Vlasov's forces who helped to defend it. The 20th Army, which at the time was being commanded by him, counter-attacked, retaking towns, and Vlasov was gaining a reputation in the press for being a defender of Moscow. His image was posted in newspapers, and he was quickly becoming a proud figure for the Soviets. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his work in defending Moscow, and was then given one of his biggest missions of the Second World War. Leningrad had been sieged by the Germans, and Vlasov was placed in charge of the 2nd Shock Army of the Volkhov Front, and was asked to try and lift the Leningrad siege of 1942. On January the 7th, his army tried to break the encirclement around the city, and it was a huge military operation. Vlasov's army crossed the Volkhov River, and he was successful in breaking through the German lines, and he managed to push through a great distance. As good as Vlasov's army was, the other forces under the command of other generals failed to support his advance, and for this could not provide assistance. This left Vlasov's forces stranded and isolated despite their territorial gains, and they asked to retreat back to regroup, but the Soviet military refused. The 2nd Shock Army were then forced to try and fight it out, and as time went on they became further isolated and weaker, before they were finally allowed to retreat. However, by June 1942, the remains of the army had been surrounded, and they were routed in a final breakout against the Germans. Vlasov himself was offered a plane to escape the encirclement, as the Soviet High Command considered him such an asset to the Soviet war effort. Vlasov refused to do this, and instead hid within German-occupied territory, moving from one place to another. He was turned over by a local farmer on July the 12th, 1943, and was handed over to the Nazis. After he was arrested, he was interrogated, and it was clear that something was amiss. During his interview, Vlasov stated that during the 10 days he'd spent hiding out, it substantiated his belief that Bolshevism was awful, and that Stalin was a great enemy of the Russian people. With this, it was clear that Vlasov intended to switch sides in the war. Whether this was a ploy to save his own skin or life, or whether he actually believed he could give the Soviets a better life under the Nazis is still to be seen. It's considered that he developed this pro-Nazi belief from his instinct for survival, and the hatred of being refused to retreat after his army made serious gains against the Germans. In prison, Vlasov met with Wilfried Strickfelt, a captain and Baltic German who was trying to rally support for the Russian Liberation Front. Strickfelt had been part of the Whites during the Russian Civil War, and he persuaded Vlasov to join his idea to help the Germans stop Stalin and Bolshevism. Vlasov then wrote to the German military high command and suggested that cooperation between the anti-Stalin Russians and the German army would lead to great success. Whilst held in custody, he was taken to Berlin under heavy guard, and he began to work alongside other Soviet soldiers to create plans for the creation of a Russian government and a recruitment drive for the Russian Liberation Front, should the German army defeat the Red Army. He founded the Russian Liberation Committee and wrote Nazi propaganda which was anti-Bolshevik, and this was dropped on millions of Soviet forces. Their once proud war hero Andrey Vlasov, who performed so well during the defence of Moscow, was now a turncoat who was producing Nazi propaganda for the enemy. No Russian Liberation Army existed at the time, however the Nazis tried to use propaganda to get some Soviets to defect. Hitler himself was cautious about Vlasov and his ideas, and he stated that under his command, an army like Vlasov's proposed should never be made. Instead, Vlasov's supporters should be absorbed into the Wehrmacht. He was concerned that Vlasov could overthrow Stalin, and with this Hitler would not be able to expand the Third Reich into Russia. Vlasov was himself given permission to make trips to parts of Russia occupied by the Nazis, where he recruited pro-German Russians. He did gain a reputation for speaking his mind, and in particular was even arrested for referring to Germans as just guests in the territory, which greatly upset the Gestapo. He even offered to resign and return to a prisoner of war camp after the incident. It was in September 1944 where Vlasov got what he wanted, when Heinrich Himmler allowed him to raise the Russian Liberation Army. Vlasov also formed and led the Committee for the Liberation of the People of Russia. Vlasov now was ready to take up arms against the Soviet Union and to fight against the Red Army he served for so long. His only military action against his homeland and the Red Army came on the Oder River on February the 11th, 1945. Here there was an intense 3 days of fighting against the Soviets, who had a huge numerical advantage over Vlasov and his group. The ROA, as it was now known, were quickly overwhelmed and forced to retreat back, heading towards Prague, which still remained under German occupation. Vlasov received a request from a commander within the division of the ROA to instead once again turn and defect, this time against the Nazis, to support the Czech resistance fighters. Vlasov even allowed the commander to work with the Czechs, turning even against the Nazis. 2 days later the group was forced out of Prague as the partisans arrested members of the group and handed over members of the Russian Liberation Army over to the Soviets for execution. Vlasov and the remaining members then headed west to attempt to surrender to the Allies and escape the Red Army as the Second World War came to an end. Eventually Vlasov's division was captured 25 miles southeast of Plzeň by the Soviets, and Vlasov himself was found hiding within a car, wrapped in 2 blankets. He was identified by his own driver, and then dragged out of the car and taken to the Soviet 13 Army's headquarters. He was then taken to Dresden, and then immediately sent to Moscow. It's clear that Andrey Vlasov was regarded as a war criminal by the Soviets, and as a despicable traitor, and he was interrogated and placed on trial. At his trial, which began on the 30th of July 1946, he was deemed to have been a traitor, and his defection over to the Nazis was deemed as high treason. The trial had been kept a secret, and all of those accused were sentenced to death on August the 1st, and were killed the very next day. The death sentences by hanging passed that day against Andrey Vlasov and many of his officers were some of the last ones passed in the Soviet Union, as they then used firing squads after. On the 2nd of August 1946, Andrey Vlasov and many of his generals, 11 of them in particular, were hanged in the courtyard of the prison they were being held in. It was said that the executions and hangings performed were rather disturbing. For many across the Soviet Union, the hanging and execution of Andrey Vlasov was not enough, as he clearly had turned across to the Nazis, and the once celebrated Soviet general was seen in an extremely negative light within the Soviet Union. All of the 12 men sentenced to death by the trial were hanged simultaneously on the gallows within the grounds of the prison. They were not subject to the long drop method. they would in fact suffer in their executions. Vlasov and the other condemned defendants were led into the courtyard, taken to the gallows and ordered to stand on a box. After this, a noose, which was then made out of rather thin rope, was placed around their necks, and they were forced to stand on the box to await their fates. As each of the condemned had the noose placed around their neck, the first men were executed with the box being taken from beneath them. The condemned were then struggling to catch their breaths. They slowly strangled to death, and with this it would have taken those men who were hanged that day a lot longer to die than if they would have used Albert Pierpoint's methods, which snapped the neck. Vlasov slowly faded away and died after being strung up inside the courtyard. For many, Andrey Vlasov was a traitor who defied the very regime he was fighting for, and the regime which in a sense he was very successful for. However, others believe he was a man who actually wasn't necessarily supporting the Nazis, but was more attempting to rid the Soviet Union and Russia of Stalin and Bolshevism. What cannot be denied is the fact he was a collaborator with the Nazis, and he fought alongside one of history's most evil regimes. Today, Andrey Vlasov is remembered as one of history's most famous turncoats and traitors. John Amery was born in Chelsea in London, and his father was a Member of Parliament and later a Conservative minister, and his mother was a Hungarian Jew. As a child, he was rather poorly behaved, going through a number of different tutors, and he was sent to Harrow boarding school, but he left after a year, being described as the most difficult boy the housemaster had tried to manage. He dreamed of a career in film production, and eventually set up a number of failing companies, which led to his bankruptcy. His early life was somewhat of a failure, and at the age of 21, John Amery married a former prostitute named Una Wing. But he could not earn enough money to keep her from the streets, and he always begged his dad for money. During this time, he was virulently anti-communist, and he became attracted to the Nazi socialist way of life, and the policies that Hitler was trying to establish across Germany. In 1936, he left Britain to go and live in France after being made bankrupt, and he met with French fascist leaders. He then visited other countries, including Germany. Amery told his family that during the Spanish Civil War, he joined Franco's nationalists and was awarded a Medal of Honor as he served in intelligence. Following the Spanish War, he returned to France and even stayed here during the German invasion of the country in June 1940. Very quickly the country fell under Nazi occupation, and there's very famous images of Hitler strolling around Paris, admiring the city he had claimed. Amery was given an offer to go and work in Germany in politics, but the difficulty of getting him out of France was there. In September 1942, Amery was given a travel permit, and he then went to Berlin, and during a meeting he proposed creating a British anti-Bolshevik group that would operate within Nazi Germany. Hitler himself was rather pleased with this and Amery's devotion, and he allowed him to reside in Germany. He then worked to produce a number of pro-German propaganda broadcasts, and even spoke to the British people to join the Nazi cause against communism. These broadcasts were attempts to break the British morale, but they overall had little impact. Amery then joined the LVF, a group that had volunteered to fight alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front, and this was initially made up of French soldiers, and Amery, who dreamed of leading a British unit, wished to recruit dozens of men to fight for their propaganda purpose. The British Free Corps was his idea, and at first the first recruits came from a group of prisoners of war, and recruiting for the group was done in prisoner of war camps. Leaflets were handed out, and research had emerged that 54 men belonged to the unit, but at one point the British Free Corps had no more than 27 men. Up until later 1944, John Amery wrote propaganda broadcasts in Berlin, but the war was greatly turning against the Germans and Hitler. He offered support to Mussolini, but the Second World War was in dire straits for the Germans, and Amery was captured. At the end of April 1945, he was captured by Italian partisans near Tacoma, along with his mistress, Michelle Thomas. They were both to be executed, but this was then commuted before they were sent to Milan and handed over to the British. Arriving back in England, Amery was sent to Bow Street Magistrates Court on the 9th of July 1945, and he was charged with 8 counts of high treason. He was then sent back to prison to await a huge trial at the Old Bailey. During his trial he stated that he never personally attacked Britain, saying he was not a Nazi, but was more anti-communist, which did not ally him as a Nazi. There were attempts to prove that he was in fact a Spanish citizen, and therefore could not commit treason against Britain, and attempts were made to make him seem mentally ill. This ultimately failed, but little needed to be done, as surprisingly on the first day of the trial, Amery decided to plead guilty on all 8 of the charges. In a remarkable and shocking turn of events, his trial only lasted 8 minutes. The judge in question confirmed to Amery what it meant, that if he admitted guilt, there would only be one outcome, his death. Amery understood fully, and it was stated, "John Amery, I am satisfied that you knew what you did, and you did it intentionally and deliberately, after you had received warning from your fellow countrymen that the course you were pursuing amounted to high treason. They called you a traitor and you heard them, but in spite of that you continued in that course. You now stand a self-confessed traitor to your king and country, and you have forfeited your right to live." A petition was launched that Amery should be reprieved, and there were claims that he was already dying of tuberculosis, but this was proven incorrect during his post-mortem. He requested that 4 photographs he held should be passed on to his brother after his execution, and during his time in Wandsworth inside a condemned cell, he smoked heavily, going through his 15-cigarette allowance a day easily. It was Albert Pierpoint and his assistant H.E. Critchell who carried out the execution of John Amery. He was later described by Pierpoint as the bravest man he ever had to execute. Pierpoint and his assistant met with Amery the day before his execution, and during this they calculated his height and weight, along with the drop required to take his life instantly. His height was recorded at 5 feet 7 inches, and his weight 140 pounds, and he was of muscular build. The day of his execution was the 19th of December 1945, to take place at Wandsworth Prison. An execution cell inside Wandsworth had been used many times over the years, and the gallows here were frequently used to execute murderers and other serious criminals. Shortly before 9 a.m, Amery was brought from his cell by 2 guards before the formal identification process took place. He was then led up to the stairs of the gallows, and on the platform was Pierpoint and his assistant. Amery extended his hand to shake Pierpoint's and said, "I've always wanted to meet you, Mr. Pierpoint, but under rather different circumstances." At this point the executioner smiled and shook his hand before spinning Amery round gently and securing his arms behind his back. He then placed the hood and noose over his head, and within seconds Amery was killed, plummeting to his death through the trapdoor below. The drop of 7 feet 8 inches was enough to kill him. He was the son of a rather prominent politician. However, John Amery's death is one which can be interpreted as rather troublesome. There is in no doubt that he went against the British, deserting his country to go and support the enemy, the Nazis, and also he produced propaganda for them. However, he did not take the life of anyone during World War II, like so many of the war criminals who were executed following the conflict did. Amery's dramatic death came at 9:01 a.m. on December the 19th, 1945, and he died a traitor who bravely decided to admit his wrongs, despite knowing exactly what came before him. He was a man who had minimal effect on anything during the conflict, but was a man that Hitler respected, a scary yet proud thing that John Amery treasured. Pierre Laval was born in June 1883, and his family were shopkeepers. As a young man he shone at school, but his father insisted that he worked in the family business. Laval did as a young man serve in the military for a year, but he was then discharged as it was deemed that he was unfit for service. He moved to Paris and studied law in 1907, and then took many working class clients whom he offered legal advice to. With regards to his legal career, Laval claimed, "I am a comrade amongst comrades, a worker amongst workers. I am not one of those lawyers who are mindful to the bourgeois origin, even when they attempt to deny it. I am not one of those highbrow attorneys who engage in academic controversies and pose as intellectual. I am proud to be what I am, a lawyer in the service of manual labourers who are my comrades, a worker like them, I am their brother." He then got involved with trade unionists, and he later won a seat in 1914 in the Chamber of Deputies as a socialist representing a working class suburb to the north of Paris. He refused to support the First World War, and Laval promoted anti-militarism and pacifism, and he never served in the war himself, and following the end of the conflict he lost his seat in the Chamber of Deputies. After this brief flirtation with politics, Laval then went back to working as a lawyer, and he became very rich, and with this change in fortunes, he then turned his back on socialism. Pierre Laval in 1923 was elected as the mayor of Aubervilliers, as he was seen as a champion of the working class, and he struggled with the local Communist Party, and Laval became very anti-communist. He was elected back to the chamber, and then in 1927 he won a Senate seat. He served in many different cabinets before he became Prime Minister for the first time in January 1931. France at the time was not affected by the economic crisis around the world, and he said that France remained healthy thanks to work and savings, and France had accumulated the largest gold reserves in the world behind the Americans. He continued to visit different nations as he served as a Prime Minister, and he seemed to deal with the Hoover moratorium, which was put forward to freeze debt payments for a year in the aftermath of the First World War. Pierre Laval at this time was seen as a competent diplomat, and he was actually named Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1931, and was the first Frenchman to be awarded this at the time. But he briefly fell from power shortly after, and he had three strong and staunch political beliefs at the time. He wanted pacifism, held strong anti-communist beliefs, and he also wanted to restore peace and positive relations with Germany. He was a hard-working Prime Minister, but was a man who was happy to go and confront other politicians around the world one-on-one to negotiate a solution to issues. But he, before the Second World War, met with Benito Mussolini in Rome, and he signed the Franco-Italian Agreement on the 4th of January 1935, ceding areas of French Somaliland to Italy in exchange for support against German aggression. Pierre Laval was seen as weak with this bending to Mussolini, and he was also said to have held fascist beliefs. Laval also negotiated a secret plan to give Italy much of the territory that the French had conquered in East Africa, with the hopes of ending the Abyssinia crisis. This led to public outrage when the plan leaked, and Laval was forced to resign on the 22nd of January 1936. But Pierre Laval did not take his latest fall from grace well, and he believed he was trying to maintain peace and to prevent another world war. He returned to his hometown with his huge wealth, and he created a media empire. However, his belief to come to some agreement with Germany was becoming an obsession, and he was hoping to come to some form of peace with the country, but of course this would not happen. He led a right-wing anti-communist group of politicians who wanted to seek peace with Hitler and opposed the declaration of war which emerged following the German invasion of Poland. Hitler would then turn his attention towards France, and the nation would collapse and would find itself occupied by the Germans. In this, the French Prime Minister stepped down, and Pierre Laval had brought Philippe Pétain into cabinet, and he formed a cabinet. He said he would seek an armistice, and Laval supported this and then joined the cabinet. Pétain was the head of state, and Laval became the vice president of the Council of Ministers and the successor. Laval, though, was seen as a collaborator with the Germans, and he held good relations with German ambassadors in Paris, including Otto Abetz, and he arranged a meeting with Hitler and Pétain, which led to Pétain's admission that France would try and collaborate with the Nazis. The extent of this collaboration would later turn incredibly deadly, as the Germans imposed their brutal policies of persecution onto the nation, and many people were transferred to concentration camps and then extermination camps from France. The French state of Vichy was a civil authority over all France, but the ultimate authority was the German occupation. German troops later occupied all of the country, and Pierre Laval was the victim of an assassination plot at one point. But he did return to power on the 18th of August 1942, and he met the harsh wishes that the Germans wanted from France to appease them. He later admitted, "I hope for a German victory to stop Bolshevism and communism." But the Nazis were now ramping up the persecution whilst he served as a Prime Minister, and Laval asked the French police to carry out raids to seize Jews, and this caused chaos, and he also ordered that Jewish children should be deported with their parents, as he said they would fill up a quota of 50,000 Jews that the Nazis wanted from France. Laval went beyond his orders to appease the Germans. When confronted with criticism regarding the deportation of Jewish children, Laval stated, "Not one must remain in France." With this, he was seen as a horrific collaborator, but he then became the leader of the newly created milice, or the militia. These were paramilitary groups who fought against the French resistance, and they executed and assassinated many, and also helped to round up those who were being deported. The milice also used torture to extract information from their captives. Hitler then asked the French government to fight alongside him, and for Vichy to declare war against the British, but during the Normandy landings, Laval made a speech to the people of France. He said, "You are not in the war, you must not take part in the fighting. If you do not observe this rule, if you show proof of indiscipline, you will provoke reprisals, the harshness of which the government would be powerless to moderate. You would suffer, both physically and materially, and you would add to your country's misfortunes. You will refuse to heed the insidious appeals which will be addressed to you. Those who ask you to stop work or invite you to revolt are the enemies of our country. You will refuse to aggravate the foreign war on our soil with the horror of civil war. At this moment fraught with drama, when the war has been carried onto our territory, show your worthy and disciplined attitude that you are thinking of France and only of her." But Pierre Laval was then 2 months later arrested, and the rest of the Vichy government was moved to Sigmaringen in Germany. Pétain lived inside of Hohenzollern Castle, and Laval had lived here, but then he was assigned to a different castle. In April 1945, the US Army led by George S. Patton was approaching, and Laval was forced to try and escape, and he was given permission to try and go to Spain, and he flew out on a Luftwaffe aircraft to Barcelona. But then later, Charles de Gaulle pressurised the Spanish and Franco to turn over Pierre Laval, and he was then handed over to the Americans, who arrested he and his wife, and he was then imprisoned inside of Fresnes prison. Pierre Laval was tried for treason and for his collaboration, which had resulted in the deaths of thousands. He believed he could convince the French population that he was acting in the best interests of their nation, and his trial began on the 4th of October 1945. He was charged with plotting against the security of the state and intelligence and collaboration with the enemy. His lawyers thought he would be acquitted, however his trial lasted a matter of days, and the jury at times hurled abuse at him. He was sentenced to death for his crimes. Pierre Laval's execution was scheduled for the 15th of October 1945 at Fresnes prison. One news article from the time documents his execution. It was said, "When his advocates told him last night that General de Gaulle would not commute the sentence or the Minister of Justice order a retrial, Laval had been composed and cheerful. When this morning at 8:45 a.m, Mornay, the Procurator General, came to him to inform him he was to be executed at 9:30, Laval was lying in his bed. Without replying, he put his head under the blanket. His advocates thought he had a moment of weakness, and one of them raised the blanket to ask him to muster himself, but saw at once from Laval's appearance that he must have taken poison. He was already losing consciousness. He had in fact drunk from a bottle of cyanide or potassium, which he still held, but in his hurry he had not drained the bottle and had not shaken it before drinking. Immediately medical attention prevented his attempted death, and half an hour later Laval was again conscious. A letter by his bedside said the following: "To my advocates, for their information, to my executioners, for their shame. I refuse to be killed by French bullets. I will not make French soldiers accomplices in a judicial murder. I have chosen my death, the poison of the Romans, which I have carried with me through my long wanderings, which have escaped the searches of my guards. I wish to be buried with the tricolour scarf round my neck. I die because I loved my country too much. My last thought is for France." Pierre Laval was restored to consciousness, and he did not escape his execution. The firing squad was brought from the fort of Cantillon to execute him, where his execution was originally to have taken place, but Laval placed a white tie round his neck, and also a tricolour scarf around his neck, as he was led to his execution. He was led into the prison courtyard, and a chair was sat in a corner, and Laval was then secured to this. He told the firing squad, "I pity you for having to execute this crime. Aim at my heart. Long live France." After the final checks were made, The firing squad aimed their rifles at the former Prime Minister, and his eyes had not been covered to allow him to see his executioners in his final moments, and he was also not allowed to give the order to fire. Ruthlessly, the executioners then fired into the former Prime Minister, Pierre Laval, and he was instantly executed. Pierre Laval was seen as a collaborator with the evil Nazis and the Germans, and he was seen as a turncoat by many inside of his nation. He was found guilty of plotting against the security of the state and of collaboration, and because of this, he was executed by a firing squad inside of a French prison.